For 1 week, Adrian Holt stopped being the most powerful man in the room. He became the man no one looked at twice. It started with a letter. Not an email, not a report flagged urgent by his chief of staff. An actual letter written on lined paper in careful, slightly uneven handwriting, slipped into his executive mailbox by a logistics coordinator named Walter Briggs before Walter went out on disability leave for a spinal injury he'd been managing quietly for 2 years without telling anyone. Mr. Holt, I've worked the receiving dock at Meridian Supply Co. for 16 years. I don't think you know what this company feels like from the ground floor. I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as a fact. The letter was 4 paragraphs. Adrian read it 3 times that Sunday evening, standing in the kitchen of his downtown Nashville penthouse with a glass of bourbon he forgot to drink. Walter described dock workers blamed for delivery failures caused by scheduling software no one had properly updated. He described a supervisor who had been reported 3 times for creating a hostile environment and remained in his position because he hit his quarterly numbers. He described the way invisible people had learned to stay invisible because visibility only brought scrutiny. The company runs fine from the top, sir, but I don't think it runs the same way from where I'm standing. Adrian had spent 11 years building Meridian Supply Co. from a regional freight brokerage into a national logistics operation with 4 distribution centers and a corporate office in Nashville that employees called the Glass Tower, not affectionately. He'd read every quarterly report. He'd approved every culture initiative. He'd sat through dozens of town halls where people told him exactly what they thought he wanted to hear, and he had believed most of it because believing it was easier than questioning it. Walter's letter made it impossible to keep believing. That Monday, Adrian left the Glass Tower at noon. He took the service exit. He drove himself to a uniform supplier in East Nashville and purchased 2 sets of gray work shirts and matching pants. He asked a contact in facilities to pull a temporary access badge under the name Roy Slade. He left his watch, a gift from his late father, in the glove compartment of his car. By Tuesday morning, Roy Slade arrived at the Meridian corporate campus at 6:45 a.m. with a clipboard and a maintenance card, and absolutely nobody paid him any attention at all. The Glass Tower's internship intake happened to begin that same week. 32 candidates from universities across the Southeast had been selected for Meridian's flagship leadership development program. They arrived that Tuesday morning carrying laptop bags and the particular anxiety of people who had worked very hard to be in a room and were now terrified of doing something wrong in it. Adrian pushed his cart along the edge of the lobby, wiping down baseboards, and watched them gather near the welcome desk. Most of them looked at their phones. A few spoke in low, careful voices. One young man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that fit too perfectly for someone who wasn't being paid yet, stood at the center of a small circle and talked loudly about his summer at a consulting firm in Atlanta. Adrian noted him and looked away. Near the back of the group, a young woman stood slightly apart from the others. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, and shoes that were sensible rather than fashionable. She wasn't checking her phone. She was reading the mission statement printed on the lobby wall. Actually reading it, her head tilted slightly as though she were testing the words against something she already knew. Her name tag read, Iris Tan, Intern Supply Chain Track. Adrian moved his cart around the edge of the welcome area and began wiping down the glass partition near the seating wall. A group of 3 interns passed him without looking up. One of them was still holding a coffee cup from a shop down the street. When she finished it, she set it on the corner of his cart as she walked by. Not in a trash can. On his cart, as a surface, available to her because he was standing next to it. He said nothing. By 10 a.m., he understood what Walter Briggs had been trying to tell him. It wasn't any single act of cruelty. It was the aggregate of small permissions, the ways a building full of people had quietly agreed that certain people existed in a different category of visibility, a door allowed to swing shut, a name not learned because a uniform made it unnecessary, a cart used as furniture, small things, each one trivially deniable, collectively suffocating. Then something changed. He was wiping down a row of chairs outside the second-floor training suite when he heard someone dragging a heavy equipment case across the corridor. The corner of the case caught on the threshold and refused to move. Adrian turned. Iris Tan was crouched low, trying to angle the case past the lip of the doorframe while balancing a binder under one arm. She didn't call for help. She didn't wait for someone to notice. She was just working the problem quietly with both hands. Adrian walked over without thinking. "You've got to tilt it." He reached for the other handle. "Come up on the left side." Iris looked up. For a moment she seemed surprised, not that he was helping, but that he had appeared at all. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't want to block the whole doorway." Together they lifted the case over the threshold. It wasn't graceful. The binder she was holding slipped and papers scattered across the floor. Both of them crouched to gather them at the same time, and for a second they were just two people collecting papers off a hallway floor, which was not something Adrian had done in a very long time. "Supply chain analysis," he said, glancing at the headers on the pages. "Inventory forecasting?" Iris looked at him more carefully. "You know what that is?" "Some," Adrian said. She studied him for a half-second with the expression of someone recalibrating. Then she smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile that didn't have anything to perform in it. "I'm Iris," she said. "First day." "Roy," he said. "Every day." She laughed, not loudly, just a quick exhale of genuine amusement. Then she picked up the rest of the papers, thanked him again, and went inside. Adrian stood in the hallway for a moment before picking up his cloth again. Inside the training room, through the glass wall, he watched the program director, a woman named Sandra Price, begin sorting the interns into teams with the efficiency of someone who had already decided which ones would matter. The tall young man, in the too-perfect suit, his badge said Brett Langston, was installed as a team lead within 10 minutes, which Adrian noted, because no selection process had been explained or conducted. Sandra simply glanced around the room and said, "Brett, I want you coordinating the Alpha group." And Brett accepted with the right amount of modest confidence, and that was that. Iris was assigned to Brett's group. Adrian picked up his card and moved down the hall. The next 3 days taught him things no quarterly report had thought to measure. Brett Langston was good at seeming competent. That was a specific and learnable skill, different from actually being competent, and Brett had mastered the former without much investment in the latter. He spoke with authority about frameworks he cited by name. He deferred to Sandra in ways that made him appear collaborative. He asked questions that were designed to display the sophistication of the asker rather than to acquire information. Adrian had hired versions of Brett Langston before. He recognized the type with the particular fatigue of someone who had spent years being impressed by surfaces. Iris was different. Iris asked questions that were embarrassingly basic and turned out to be the only questions that mattered. On Wednesday morning, during a case study review about delivery delays on the eastern distribution route, she raised her hand and said, "I'm looking at the weather data from last November. The delays don't correlate with road conditions. They correlate with the staffing log. Were the dock teams understaffed on the nights before the delays spiked?" The room went quiet. The answer, Adrian knew from his own files, was yes. 3 dock supervisors had approved reduced crews on successive Thursdays to bring labor costs below a quarterly target. The metric had looked good. The downstream effect had not appeared in the same spreadsheet. Sandra said, "That's an interesting observation," in a tone that was not interested. Brett said, "Good catch, Iris. We can fold that into the regional context piece." Iris nodded. She wrote something in her notebook. Adrian, wiping down the glass wall outside, watched Brett take out his laptop and type for 2 minutes. He watched Brett highlight Iris's name in the shared document, then move it from the analysis section to a smaller footnote column at the bottom labeled Research Contributions. He watched Brett retitle the analysis section with his own name at the top. It happened in less than 3 minutes. No one saw it except Adrian. That night he reviewed the version history of the team's shared document from the security office on the 2nd floor. Iris's staffing analysis, which was in fact the structural insight that made the whole proposal coherent, had been renamed, recategorized, and attributed to the team broadly, which in practice meant attributed to the lead, which meant attributed to Brett. He sat with that for a long time. On Thursday, the program held a midweek review lunch in the executive dining room. The interns were encouraged to network. Sandra Price brought 2 senior managers from operations and a VP named Richard Chow who made periodic rounds of the room saying encouraging things that committed him to nothing. Adrian was assigned to help the facilities team clear and reset the room. He moved along the perimeter, collecting plates, watching. Brett Langston orbited Richard Chow with expert precision. Every sentence he spoke was calibrated, specific enough to seem knowledgeable, vague enough to be unverifiable. "We're approaching the Eastern route analysis from a systems-level frame," Brett told Richard, nodding thoughtfully. "The key insight is about feedback loop integrity, where delays originate versus where they're reported." Richard said, "I like that systems-level thinking." Iris stood near the end of the buffet table, holding a glass of water, talking to a junior analyst from procurement who seemed genuinely interested in what she was saying. Adrian moved closer to refill a water pitcher nearby. "The staffing correlation is the real story," Iris was saying quietly. "If you fix the routing software without fixing the Thursday crew problem, you'll just produce cleaner data for the same delay pattern." The junior analyst nodded. "Have you brought that to Brett?" Iris paused. "I raised it in the session." "But did he use it in the framework?" Another pause. "He restructured it." The analyst looked at her carefully. "You should go talk to Richard Chow." Iris glanced across the room at Richard, then at Brett standing next to him, comfortable and bright, speaking the language of the room with total fluency. She swallowed something that Adrian recognized because he had swallowed versions of it himself before he had enough power to stop having to. She didn't cross the room. Adrian carried the water pitcher back to the station. Behind him, Brett was telling Richard a version of the staffing insight that had become the systems-level frame. Richard said, "That's the kind of thinking we want to see in the leadership track." Adrian set the pitcher down and gripped the edge of the counter for exactly 3 seconds. He let it go, not because it was fine. Because when he spoke, he wanted to be standing at the right side of the table. The crisis came on Thursday afternoon when it usually does, quietly and then all at once. The intern cohort had been scheduled for a site visit to Meridian's Nashville Distribution Center, a working facility, 200,000 square feet of conveyor belts, forklift lanes, and dock bays. Adrian had arranged to be assigned to the maintenance crew rotating through the facility that afternoon. He needed to see how things worked when no one was performing. What he saw, dock supervisors who flinched when managers walked through. A safety board with 2 open incident reports that had been there for 11 days without resolution. A locker room where 3 workers had written complaints about shift assignments in a binder that sat on a shelf with no evidence anyone had read it. What the interns saw on their guided tour with Sandra, the conveyor system, the inventory software interface, the ergonomic loading stations that had been installed 18 months ago for a company publication. Brett photographed the loading stations for his LinkedIn. Iris walked through the dock bay slowly, asking a loader named Curtis about the timing of his shift assignments. Curtis looked surprised that she was asking. He answered carefully, the way people answer when they have learned that honesty about problems tends to become their problem, but he answered. Adrian watched from across the floor. Then a pallet jack, overloaded by a miscalculation, slipped off its track near the east bay and sent a row of boxes sliding into the aisle. No one was hurt, but the aisle needed to be cleared quickly. The facility manager called for maintenance assistance. Adrian moved toward the aisle. 2 interns stepped back. One of them said, "Is this going to delay the tour?" Brett looked at the mess and then at Sandra. "Should we wait in the break room?" Iris was already in the aisle picking up boxes. She wasn't doing it to be seen. There was no one watching her except Adrian and Curtis. She was doing it because there was a mess in front of her and her hands were free and it needed to be done. That was all. Curtis moved to help her. Adrian came in from the other side. The 3 of them cleared the aisle in 4 minutes while the rest of the group waited near the break room. When they finished, Iris stood up and stretched her back. She looked at Adrian. "You okay?" "Fine," he said. "Good work." She shrugged. It was just boxes. "Most people waited," he said. She looked toward the break room. Something crossed her face, not bitterness exactly, but the specific tiredness of someone who had stopped being surprised by what most people did. "I noticed," she said. She started back toward the group. Curtis watched her go, then looked at Adrian. "She's going to have a hard time here," he said, not meanly, just as a fact. Adrian looked at him. "Why?" Curtis shrugged. "Places like this, the people who actually do the work don't get credit for it. The people who describe the work getting done do." He paused. "I've been here 9 years. I know the difference." Adrian stood with that for the rest of the afternoon. That night, alone in the security office, he opened the version history again. Then he pulled the intern evaluation drafts that Sandra Price had uploaded to the program portal. Brett's file: exceptional executive presence, strong strategic framing, natural team lead qualities. Iris's file: technically competent, needs development in executive communication, may struggle with ambiguity at scale. He read the last phrase 3 times. Ambiguity at scale. The woman who had identified the actual cause of an 8-month delivery problem and then cleared a blocked aisle without being asked was being assessed as someone who might struggle with ambiguity. He opened the incident log from the distribution center. The 2 open reports on the safety board had been there for 11 days because the facility manager had submitted them upward and received no response. Walter Briggs had filed a similar report 14 months ago. It was in the same digital folder, marked received, time-stamped, and never acted upon. Adrian sat in the dark of the security office for a long time. He had built something. He had not seen it clearly. Those were 2 different failures, and they were both his. The final presentation was scheduled for Friday morning at 9. The board, 3 senior VPs, and Sandra would evaluate the intern teams. Adrian arrived at 6:30 as Roy Slade took his cart to the 3rd floor and positioned himself outside the presentation room. At 8:50, the interns filed in. Brett Langston sat up at the front of the room. His slides were beautiful. Adrian knew they were beautiful because he had seen the document evolve across the week, had watched the language get cleaner and more confident as it moved further from the actual problem and closer to the kind of answer that looked good in a presentation. The board member who concerned Adrian most was a woman named Helen Forsyth, who had joined the board 2 years ago from a background in operations and who asked questions that were not designed to flatter. Helen sat at the corner of the table with reading glasses on and a printed copy of the brief in front of her. Brett began. He was smooth. He had good instincts about when to pause, when to gesture toward a slide, when to let silence work for him. Sandra Price watched him with the contented expression of someone seeing their projection confirmed. Then Helen Forsyth leaned forward. "Mr. Langston, the staffing correlation your proposal references, the Thursday crew reduction pattern. Walk me through how you identified that." Brett said, "We triangulated the delay data against multiple operational variables." "Specifically the staffing log," Helen said. "That's a specific incorrect connection. Where did it originate in your team's process?" Brett paused for less than 2 seconds. The team worked collaboratively through the data. "I'm asking about origin." Helen looked up from her papers. "Who first identified the correlation?" A silence fell over the room with the particular weight of silences that have been earned. Iris sat in the 2nd row. She was perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Adrian could see from the hallway that she was not going to speak. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she had already learned, in 5 days, what happened to women in rooms like this who claimed things. Adrian looked at his cart. He looked at the badge clipped to his shirt that said Roy Slade. He thought about Walter Briggs, who had mailed a letter on lined paper because there was no other way to be heard. He thought about Curtis saying, "I've been here 9 years." He pushed his cart to the doorway and stopped. Helen Forsyth looked up. Sandra Price frowned. One of the VPs said, "Maintenance, this room is in session." Adrian unclipped the badge from his shirt and set it on the cart. Then he walked in. He did not rush. He walked the way he walked when he was himself, which is to say, deliberately, and with the particular quiet of someone who has spent years being the calmest person in a difficult room. He stopped at the head of the table. "My name is Adrian Holt," he said. The room did not react immediately. Reaction takes a moment when reality has rearranged itself too quickly for comprehension. Sandra Price's expression moved through 3 stages in about 4 seconds. 2 board members who recognized him immediately sat up straighter. Helen Forsyth took off her reading glasses. Brett Langston went the color of old paper. Adrian looked at Helen. To answer your question, the staffing correlation was identified by Iris Tan on Wednesday morning. It was the structural insight that made the rest of the proposal coherent. I watched it happen. I also watched it get moved to a footnote by 11 o'clock that same morning. He looked at the screen behind Brett, where Brett's beautiful slides were still projected. I've spent this week working the building as a facilities employee. I did it because I received a letter from a dock worker who told me I didn't understand what this company felt like from the ground floor. He was right. Adrian looked at Sandra. The evaluation currently in the program portal for Iris Tan describes her as someone who may struggle with ambiguity at scale. She identified a systemic problem that our operations team has not identified in 8 months, and then cleared a blocked dock aisle without being asked while her cohort waited in a break room. That is not ambiguity. That is competence without an audience, which is the only kind that actually matters. Sandra opened her mouth. There will be an independent review of the program, Adrian said. That review will look at how candidates are evaluated, how credit is assigned, and what the current culture in this building is teaching people who are new enough to still be watching carefully. He paused. Sandra, you're suspended pending that review. The room stayed quiet. Adrian turned to the board. I also want to pull the Walter Briggs incident file and the 2 open safety reports from the distribution center into today's session. Those have been waiting on responses for periods that I find unacceptable. He looked at Helen. I'd like your help with the review structure. Helen was already writing. Adrian turned to Iris. She was watching him with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Not gratitude, not shock, but something more complex. The look of someone who has been told they were right about something they had already started to doubt. Miss Tan, he said, would you present your analysis? Iris stood. She walked to the front of the room. She pulled up the original document on her laptop, not Brett's version, hers. The one with the staffing logs in the core analysis section, her name at the top. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not quite, but she didn't try to hide that. She talked about dock crews and Thursday patterns and the difference between where a problem originates and where it gets reported. She talked about the feedback gap, the distance between the people who touch the work and the people who describe it in presentations. She talked about Curtis, without using his name, as someone who had understood the problem for 9 years and had never been in a room like this one. Nobody interrupted her. When she finished, Helen Forsyth asked 2 follow-up questions. Both were the kind of questions that take the person being asked seriously. Iris answered both without hesitation. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then Adrian said, "Thank you." After that, Beridian Supply Cone did not transform overnight, and Adrian made certain no one pretended it had. The review took 6 weeks. It produced 31 specific findings. The supervisor at the distribution center who had remained in his position through 3 complaints was let go. The safety reports were formalized into a response protocol with mandatory timelines. Walter Briggs, still on leave, was contacted directly. He came back part-time as a dock operations consultant, a role he accepted with the skepticism of someone who had learned not to trust titles. He turned out to be the most useful person in the room at 3 separate planning meetings. Brett Langston resigned before the review concluded. He sent an email to Sandra that was forwarded to Adrian by mistake. It described the situation as politically untenable, which Adrian thought was at least honest. Iris Tan was offered a full-time position on the supply chain analytics team. Adrian did not sit in on her hiring process. He did not mention her name to the hiring manager or adjust the compensation offer. He asked a colleague he trusted to evaluate her on the work, and the work was sufficient, which he had known it would be. He ran into her weeks later in the elevator at the end of a long Tuesday. She was carrying the same binder from the first day. He recognized it by the bent corner. "How is it going?" he said. Not quite a question. "Honestly," Iris said. "Ideally," he said. She thought about it. "It's better. The team asks real questions." She paused. "Curtis got put on the incident response working group." Adrian nodded. "I heard." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the glass atrium, where the mission statement was still printed on the far wall. "Driven by integrity. Built on trust." Iris looked at it for a moment. "I read that on the first day," she said. "I wasn't sure whether to believe it." "What about now?" Adrian asked. She thought about that too. She was someone who actually thought before she answered, which he had noticed the first time and never stopped noticing. "I think it's a direction," she said, "not a destination." She walked out through the glass doors into the Nashville evening, where the light was doing something particular to the street, turning the ordinary into something worth looking at if you were paying attention. Adrian stood for a moment at the edge of the lobby, in the building he had built, which he was finally starting to understand. Then he walked out after her into the same light, and for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about what came next. He was just here, in the only moment he actually had. That was, he thought, probably where he should have been all along. I keep thinking about the moment Adrian set that badge on the cart, not the reveal, not the boardroom silence, just that one small motion, setting down the thing that had been protecting him from being seen. Most of us spend our whole careers learning to put things on. Titles, credentials, the right language for the right room. We get good at it, and then we mistake the armor for the person underneath it, which is how you end up running a company for 11 years without actually knowing what it feels like to work there. Adrian had integrity. He built a real company. He took Walter's letter seriously when it would have been far easier to file it away. But integrity without awareness is just good intentions with a blind spot. What I find honest about his story is that he didn't go undercover to confirm what he already believed. He went because he suspected he might be wrong. That's a harder thing to do. It requires something more than being a decent person. It requires being willing to be uncomfortable in a way that costs you something. And then there's Iris. Iris didn't pick up those boxes at the distribution center because someone was watching. She did it because there was a mess and her hands were free. She didn't speak up in the boardroom immediately because she had already learned, in 5 days, exactly what that cost. She waited. She sat still with her hands in her lap. But she didn't disappear. She had already done the hard intellectual work, the staffing correlation, the feedback gap analysis, the 9 years of patterns that Curtis had been describing to anyone who asked. She had put all of that together before anyone acknowledged it mattered. That kind of persistence, doing rigorous work inside a system that keeps moving your name to the footnotes, takes a specific kind of strength that doesn't get talked about enough. It's quiet. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't sound impressive at a networking lunch. But it's the thing that holds up under pressure, and Brett Langston's slides did not. What I think about most, though, is Curtis. 9 years. He understood the problem better than anyone in that boardroom, and the information never traveled upward because the building had never been designed to carry it. That's not a staffing failure. That's a moral failure. The decision made slowly and collectively over time that certain people's observations don't count as data. The thing Adrian's story keeps asking is whether you're building something that can hear the truth, or something that can only manage it. Those are different things. One requires you to stay close to the people doing the actual work, even when it's inconvenient, even when the quarterly reports look fine. The other just requires a good PR strategy and a mission statement on the lobby wall. I don't think most broken cultures are built by cruel people. I think they're built by capable people who stopped asking hard questions because the easy answers were working well enough. Which means the repair isn't dramatic. It's just the daily decision to keep asking, to take the letter seriously, to learn the name on the badge, to notice who's clearing the aisle while everyone else waits in the break room.